My daughter took me to court to seize my $2 million estate. She looked the judge right in the eye and swore under oath that I had advanced dementia and could no longer feed myself. She smiled when she handed over the forged medical records. Then the judge looked down from the bench, held up a corporate document, and asked a single question. "Do you know who Mr. Vernon actually is?" The courtroom fell dead silent. The blood completely drained from my daughter's face. Before I tell you how I dismantled her life in 30 seconds, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an arrogant family member a lesson they will never forget. The morning the ambush began, I was kneeling on my front porch, replacing a rotted floorboard. I am 67 years old, but 40 years as a civil engineer means my hands still know how to work. The sun was hot and the neighborhood was quiet. A gray sedan pulled into my driveway. A man in a cheap wrinkled suit stepped out holding a thick manila envelope. He did not introduce himself. He simply asked if I was Richard Vernon. When I nodded, he tossed the envelope onto the porch stairs, told me I had been officially served, and drove away. I wiped the sawdust from my hands and tore open the seal. The heavy stack of legal documents was topped with an emergency conservatorship order. My eyes scanned the bold print. The petitioner was Melissa, my only daughter. The claims detailed in the petition made my blood run cold. She stated I was suffering from rapid cognitive decline. She claimed I frequently left the stove on, wandered the neighborhood at night, and was completely incapable of managing my own finances. She had asked the court to grant her immediate and total control over my life, my home, and my bank accounts. A sharp memory pierced through my shock. 2 years ago, Melissa sat weeping on my living room couch. Her husband, Todd, had started a logistics company that was on the verge of total collapse. She begged me for help, swearing it would be a one-time request to save their family. I liquidated a very safe performing asset and handed them $500,000 in cash to keep Todd out of bankruptcy. They hugged me. They called me their savior. Now I was holding a piece of paper that declared I was a confused old man who needed to be locked away for his own good. I set the papers down on the porch rail. I needed to finish the repair before the wood warped. I drove my truck down to the local hardware store to buy a box of galvanized screws. I walked up to the register and handed the cashier my debit card. The machine beeped a loud, angry tone. Declined. I pulled out my primary credit card. Declined. The teenage cashier looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. I stepped out of the line, my heart pounding against my ribs. I pulled up my banking app on my phone. A bright red banner stretched across the screen. My accounts were locked due to an emergency court injunction. They had not just filed papers, they had successfully severed my financial lifeline without ever looking me in the eye. I left the hardware store and drove straight to Melissa's neighborhood. She lived in an upscale gated community in a massive house that I had personally helped furnish with the money they supposedly could not afford to spend. I parked my truck aggressively in her pristine driveway. I did not pound on the door. I rang the bell once and waited. Melissa opened the door. The moment she saw me, her fake smile vanished. A flash of profound guilt crossed her eyes, but she quickly buried it beneath a hardened, defensive glare. She did not say a word. She turned her back and walked away from the door, retreating toward her expansive kitchen. I stepped inside and followed her. I walked up to the granite island. I dropped the thick stack of legal papers right next to her expensive espresso machine. The heavy thud echoed in the silent room. I asked her to explain why she was trying to steal my life. Before she could answer, Todd strolled into the kitchen. He was wearing a designer golf polo and a perfectly rehearsed look of false sympathy. He stepped between me and my daughter. He put his hands up, adopting a patronizing tone, speaking to me slowly, as if I were a frightened toddler. He told me to calm down. He said my memory was failing and that I was becoming a danger to myself. He claimed they were only doing this because they loved me and wanted to ensure I was safe in a proper medical facility. I did not raise my voice. I stared directly into Todd's eyes. I saw the greed dancing behind his fake concern. I realized instantly that Todd was the architect of this betrayal and Melissa was his willing accomplice. I asked them how they planned to pay for this supposed medical facility, considering they still owed me $500,000. Todd crossed his arms and let out a smug little laugh. He told me I did not need to worry about money anymore. He said they were taking over the burden of managing my assets. He leaned forward and told me not to worry about the upkeep of my vintage Mustang and my fully restored Corvette. He casually mentioned that the auction house appraiser had already been to my garage yesterday, and the catalog for my car collection was going live on Friday. The gravity of his mistake hit me like a physical blow. They had been inside my garage. They had brought strangers onto my property while I was at the grocery store. They were not just freezing my accounts today. They had been meticulously planning the liquidation of my life for months. They were moving with terrifying speed, trying to strip me bare before I even realized I was in a fight. I looked at Melissa. She stared at the floor, refusing to meet my gaze. I turned around and walked out of their house. I knew that any word I spoke would be used as evidence of my supposed erratic behavior. I drove back to my house as the sun began to set. My mind was racing, cataloging every asset, every vulnerability. I pulled into my neighborhood and turned onto my street. A strange black SUV was parked directly in front of my driveway. As I pulled up, a large man wearing a tactical uniform stepped off my front porch. I put my truck in park and stepped out. The security guard held up a hand to stop me from approaching my own front door. He produced a clipboard from his belt. He read from a document stating that the property was now under the temporary legal guardianship of Melissa, and that the current resident, Mister Vernon, was strictly prohibited from entering the premises without supervised medical escort. I walked past him and inserted my house key into the front door deadbolt. The key slid in, but it refused to turn. The locks had already been completely replaced. I looked at the brass housing. It was brand new. They had changed the locks while I was standing in their kitchen. The guard placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. He told me to step back down the stairs. He warned me that if I caused a disturbance, he was legally obligated to call the police and have me detained for a psychiatric evaluation. This was the moment they expected me to break. They expected the confused, betrayed old man to scream, to pound his fists against the heavy oak door, to make a scene that would perfectly validate their fabricated narrative of dementia and instability. I did not argue with the man. I did not shed a single tear. I nodded calmly. I turned around and walked down the porch steps. I walked down the driveway, but I did not go to my truck. I walked around the side of the house, moving toward the detached garage in the back. The guard followed me, shouting that the garage was also off limits. I ignored him. I walked past the heavy rolling doors and approached a small utility box mounted on the side of the brick wall. It looked like a standard electrical meter housing. I flipped the metal cover open. Behind a fake panel was a biometric fingerprint scanner. I pressed my thumb against the glass. A hidden compartment built directly into the foundation clicked open. I reached inside and pulled out a heavy leather duffel bag. I had packed this bag 5 years ago, shortly after my wife passed away, recognizing that the world was unpredictable and that a man must always have a contingency plan. The guard stood 10 feet away, watching me with confusion. He did not know what to do because the court order covered the house, but I was not breaking into the house. I slung the bag over my shoulder. Inside that bag was a burner phone registered under a fake corporation. There was an untraceable encrypted laptop. There was $10,000 in unmarked cash. And most importantly, there was the physical master ledger and the authentication keys for Apex Holdings, a commercial real estate entity that my daughter did not even know existed. I walked back to my truck. I threw the bag onto the passenger seat. I started the engine and drove away from the home I had lived in for 30 years. I did not look back in the rearview mirror. I drove to the edge of the city, far away from my daughter's pristine suburban bubble. I pulled into the parking lot of a modest, fading motel situated next to a noisy highway overpass. I walked into the lobby and paid for a week in advance using the cash from my bag. The clerk handed me a physical brass key. I walked into the dingy room. The air smelled of stale smoke and cheap cleaning products. I locked the door and pulled the curtains completely shut. I sat down on the edge of the stiff mattress. I unzipped the leather bag and pulled out the encrypted laptop. I powered it on. The screen glowed in the dark room, casting a blue light across my face. I connected to the secure satellite network. My primary checking accounts were frozen, but my corporate empire was fully intact. My daughter thought she had just successfully locked a sick old man out of his life. She had no idea she had just locked herself in a cage with a predator. The silent adjustment had begun. The neon sign outside the motel window blinked in a slow, steady rhythm, casting a harsh red glow across the cheap wooden desk. I sat in the hard chair and stared at the glowing screen of my encrypted laptop. I was no longer a father mourning the loss of his daughter. I was a civil engineer diagnosing a catastrophic structural failure. My life was the collapsing bridge, and I needed to find the exact point where the steel had been compromised. I opened a secure browser and navigated to the regional healthcare network portal. Because of my previous career managing large-scale municipal projects, I knew exactly how to bypass the standard patient login screen and access the raw diagnostic database. I entered my social security number and the master passcode I had established years ago. The screen loaded a complete chronological history of every medical interaction I had over the past decade. I sorted the data, isolating the last 12 months. What I found was a meticulously constructed timeline of my own mental execution. Starting in October of last year, my medical profile showed a sudden, inexplicable spike in specialist visits. There were 3 distinct appointments with 3 entirely separate neurologists in 3 different cities. I stared at the dates flashing on the screen. I remembered these days, but my memory of them was heavily distorted. Melissa had framed each of these long drives as routine wellness checks required for my new premium health insurance policy. She had driven me to every single appointment. She had sat in the examination room with me, holding my hand, acting like the devoted child. I opened the physician notes for the first visit, dated October 14th. The doctor wrote that the patient's daughter reported severe short-term memory loss and frequent bouts of aggressive confusion. The clinical notes stated that I had supposedly left the gas stove burning overnight on 3 separate occasions, nearly destroying my neighborhood. This was an absolute fabrication. I have never gone to sleep without checking every appliance in the house, but the doctor had documented my daughter's lies as clinical symptoms. I clicked on the second visit, dated January 9th. The medical coding for this appointment was marked with a high-priority alert. This doctor noted that the patient appeared lethargic, completely unresponsive to basic stimuli, and unable to recall the current year or the name of the president. The third visit in March contained the most damning psychological notes of all. The specialist recorded that my daughter was deeply distressed by my violent mood swings and my complete inability to recognize my own son-in-law, Todd. I read these words, feeling a cold sweat break out on my neck. Melissa had not just lied to a single doctor. She had actively shopped around for medical professionals using my own premium insurance until she found specialists willing to document her fabricated symptoms without questioning the primary source. She was building an indestructible paper trail of insanity. Every time a doctor seemed skeptical, she simply moved on to the next clinic, adding another layer of false documentation to my permanent medical record. I sat back in the chair and closed my eyes against the harsh blue light of the laptop. I needed to understand why I had actually appeared so lethargic and unresponsive during that specific appointment in January. I have always been a sharp, fast-thinking, and highly energetic man, but as I mentally retraced my steps through the cold winter months, a dark and terrifying realization began to take shape in my mind. 8 months ago, Melissa had come to my house unannounced, carrying a large plastic organizer filled with custom dietary supplements. She told me she was deeply worried about my declining energy levels. She cried real tears in my kitchen, insisting that I take these expensive imported vitamins every single morning to protect my immune system. She even made a habit of calling me every day at exactly 9 o'clock to make sure I had swallowed the thick green capsules while she listened on the phone. I vividly remembered the heavy, crushing fatigue that would set in exactly 1 hour after taking those pills. I remembered the thick, heavy fog that clouded my brain, making it nearly impossible to read a simple newspaper article or focus on a television news broadcast. I remembered sleeping straight through my blaring alarm clock, which I had never done a single time in my entire 40-year professional career. The days I visited those 3 separate neurologists were the exact days she had personally visited my house to hand me double doses of those specific green pills, claiming I looked exceptionally tired and needed an extra boost for the long drive. I opened my eyes and stared at the cracked paint on the motel wall. My daughter had not been protecting my health. She had been chemically engineering my dementia. She had systematically poisoned me with heavy, unregulated sedatives to ensure I would perform perfectly, like a confused, failing old man in front of the medical professionals. The betrayal was so deep and so absolute that it transcended any normal feeling of parental anger. It was pure, cold-blooded, predatory calculation. She had weaponized my trust against me. Every cup of tea she poured, every vitamin she handed me, every time she held my hand in the waiting room was a calculated step toward stealing my life. I did not scream. I did not throw the laptop against the wall. The silent adjustment within my mind was complete. The father who loved Melissa died in this cheap motel room. Only the architect remained. I turned my attention back to the laptop screen and leaned forward. I scrolled past the clinical notes and opened the legal attachments section of my centralized medical file. There was a newly uploaded document at the very top of the list, flagged with a bright red priority marker. The title of the document read, "Sworn Psychiatric Affidavit of Incapacity." I clicked the file and read the text with clinical detachment. It was signed by a private psychiatrist named Dr. Alan Bergman. I had never met this man in my entire life. I had never stepped foot inside his psychiatric clinic. Then a sudden chilling memory surfaced from the fog. 2 weeks ago, Melissa had brought a tablet computer to my house. She said a medical insurance representative needed to ask me a few standard questions to verify my ongoing coverage and ensure my premiums would not increase. I had sat in front of the screen for 10 minutes, answering simple questions about my address, my date of birth, and my daily routine while Melissa stood silently behind the camera lens. That man on the screen was not an insurance representative. That was Dr. Bergman conducting a remote psychiatric evaluation under entirely false pretenses. I had been heavily sedated from the morning dose of her green pills during that exact video call. The document currently glowing on my screen was a legally binding weapon. Dr. Bergman had testified under penalty of perjury that he had personally evaluated me and determined that I suffered from advanced, irreversible neurodegenerative disease. He explicitly declared that I lacked the fundamental cognitive capacity to make even the most basic medical, financial, or personal decisions regarding my own welfare. The final paragraph was the absolute death blow. He officially recommended to the state court that my daughter Melissa be granted immediate and permanent legal conservatorship over my physical body and my entire $2 million estate. The trap was not just set, it had already been sprung with devastating precision. This specific affidavit was the exact weapon Todd and Melissa had used to convince the judge to freeze my bank accounts and lock me out of my own house earlier today. The civil court had accepted this fraudulent psychiatric document as absolute medical truth. Legally speaking, Richard Vernon no longer existed as a free, independent American citizen. I was now legally categorized as a ward of the state, completely trapped in a bureaucratic cage built by my own flesh and blood. They had erased my autonomy with a single forged signature. I stared at the electronic seal at the bottom of the affidavit. If I walked into a police station right now and tried to report this crime, the officers would simply pull up this exact document in their database. They would see a legally certified crazy person ranting about a conspiracy involving poisoned vitamins. They would immediately call my daughter to come pick me up, and she would have me legally committed to a locked memory care ward by midnight. I could not fight this battle using the standard rules of society, because society currently believed I was entirely broken. I needed a weapon that operated completely outside the boundaries of my personal identity. I closed the medical portal and wiped the browser history clean. I reached into my heavy leather bag and pulled out the encrypted cellular phone I had kept hidden for years. I dialed a secure unlisted number that bypassed all standard commercial networks. The phone rang twice before a sharp professional voice answered on the other end. The medical trail was completely mapped out, and the evidence of their betrayal was undeniable. It was now time to follow the money and locate the financial vulnerability that would allow me to burn their stolen empire to the ground. The secure cellular phone felt heavy in my hand. I dialed the private line of Bradley Collins. Bradley was my corporate attorney and the chief legal architect for Apex Holdings. He did not handle petty family disputes or draft simple wills. He managed hostile takeovers, corporate liquidations, and high-stakes financial warfare. We had worked together for over 15 years in complete secrecy. My daughter and her husband did not even know he existed. They believed my only legal representation was a retired small-town lawyer who handled my property taxes. They were entirely unaware that I had a legal predator on retainer. Bradley answered on the second ring. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him my daughter had filed a fraudulent emergency conservatorship and locked me out of my personal bank accounts. I told him about the forged medical records and the corrupt psychiatrist. Bradley did not express sympathy. Sympathy is useless in a war. He simply asked what I needed him to do. I instructed him to deploy his forensic accounting team. I wanted a complete and total financial autopsy of Todd and his supposedly struggling logistics company. I wanted every bank statement, every tax return, every hidden debt, and every shell corporation laid bare. Bradley told me he would call me back by midnight and hung up the phone. I spent the next 6 hours pacing the floor of the cheap motel room. The walls were thin, and I could hear the constant roar of highway traffic outside. It was a stark contrast to the quiet comfort of the home I had built, the home I was currently exiled from. But I did not feel sorry for myself. I felt a cold, calculated focus settling over my mind. If Todd and Melissa were willing to chemically sedate me and legally erase my existence, they were hiding a desperation that went far beyond basic greed. Greed is patient. Desperation is reckless. I knew Todd had made a mistake, and I knew Bradley would find it. The encrypted phone vibrated on the cheap wooden desk exactly at midnight. I picked it up. Bradley did not say hello. He immediately began listing a series of catastrophic financial figures. The logistics company Todd had founded was not just struggling to find clients. It was completely bankrupt and functioning as a massive criminal liability. Todd had not made a legitimate profit in over 3 years. The entire operation was a hollow shell kept alive by a continuous cycle of fraudulent accounting. Bradley explained the exact mechanics of the crime. Todd had convinced a group of private angel investors to inject millions of dollars into his company to expand his fleet of transport trucks. But Todd never bought a single truck. Instead, he diverted those investment funds into a series of offshore shadow accounts. He used that stolen money to fund the lavish lifestyle he and my daughter enjoyed. The gated mansion, the designer clothes, the country club memberships, and the expensive cars were all paid for with embezzled investor capital. My son-in-law was not a struggling entrepreneur. He was a high-level thief running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme. The situation was far worse than a simple failed business. Bradley revealed that the primary investors had grown suspicious of Todd's constant excuses and his refusal to produce physical assets. 2 weeks ago, they had officially demanded a comprehensive independent audit of the logistics company. They had hired an external accounting firm to review every single transaction Todd had made over the last 4 years. The audit was scheduled to begin at the end of this month. The moment those auditors opened Todd's books, they would instantly discover the missing millions. They would see the money flowing directly from the corporate accounts into his personal pockets. Todd was staring straight down the barrel of a massive federal indictment. Embezzling private investor funds on that scale carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in federal prison. Todd was not just trying to steal my money to buy another luxury car. He was fighting for his actual freedom. He needed a massive injection of liquid cash immediately to replace the stolen funds before the auditors arrived and uncovered the fraud. Legitimate banks had already blacklisted him. Bradley found a trail of rejected loan applications from every major financial institution in the state. Todd's credit was completely toxic, and his company had no physical assets to use as leverage. Desperate men who are locked out of the light always turn to the dark. Todd had gone to the gray market. He had approached a ruthless private equity firm known for providing massive predatory bridge loans to desperate clients. This firm did not care about credit scores or ethical business practices. They only cared about absolute guaranteed collateral. This was the exact point where my blood ran completely cold. Bradley sent a secure document directly to my laptop screen. It was a copy of the finalized loan application Todd had submitted to the private equity firm. Todd had requested a bridge loan of $1.5 million. In the section demanding collateral, Todd had not listed his house or his business. He had listed my personal estate. He had listed my vintage car collection, my fully paid-off suburban home, and my $2 million retirement portfolio. I stared at the screen, reading the fine print of the betrayal. Todd had attached the forged psychiatric affidavit to the loan application. He had used Dr. Bergman's fraudulent diagnosis of my advanced dementia to convince the private equity firm that I was legally incompetent. He included a copy of the pending emergency conservatorship petition. He essentially promised the ruthless lenders that within a matter of weeks, he and Melissa would possess total, uncontested legal authority to liquidate every single asset I had spent my entire life building. He had successfully collateralized my existence. He had sold my life, my freedom, and my sanity to a group of financial predators just to save himself from a federal prison cell. Melissa had helped him do it. She had poisoned me with sedatives and dragged me to corrupt doctors, knowing full well that the ultimate goal was to hand my life savings over to a shadow lending firm. They were going to drain my accounts, pay back the angry investors, cover up Todd's massive embezzlement, and leave me rotting in a locked state-run memory care facility with absolutely nothing. Bradley's voice broke through my silence. He warned me that the situation was critical. The private equity firm had officially approved the predatory loan. They had agreed to the brutal terms and were ready to wire the $1.5 million directly into Todd's corporate account. But they were predators, not fools. They had inserted a final execution clause into the contract. The money was currently sitting in a secure escrow account. It would only be released to Todd the exact moment a civil court judge signed the final permanent conservatorship order granting Melissa absolute control over my estate. The pieces of the trap snapped together perfectly in my mind. The emergency injunction they served me with today was just a temporary freeze to prevent me from hiding my money. The real battle was at the final court hearing. Todd had intentionally manipulated the legal system to schedule that hearing just days before his corporate audit was set to begin. Everything he had, his freedom, his marriage, his entire life hinged on winning that court case and having me officially declared insane by a judge. If they won the hearing, the judge would sign the order. The private equity firm would instantly release the funds. Todd would replace the embezzled money, survive the audit, and walk away clean. I would be legally erased, stripped of my assets, and locked in a medical prison until the day I died. But if they lost the hearing, the loan would be canceled. The auditors would find the missing millions. Todd would go to federal prison, and their entire empire of lies would collapse into dust. Bradley asked if I wanted him to take this evidence directly to the police. I told him absolutely not. If the police arrested Todd for embezzlement tonight, his company would simply file for bankruptcy protection. The federal authorities would seize his assets, and he would go to jail, but he would never truly understand the magnitude of his mistake. He would just be another criminal caught by the system. That was not an acceptable outcome. Todd and Melissa had tried to destroy my mind. They had tried to strip me of my dignity and lock me in a cage. Justice from a courtroom was not enough. I needed absolute annihilation. I ordered Bradley to keep his team completely silent. I told him to let Todd believe his plan was working perfectly. I looked at the glowing screen of my encrypted laptop and the details of the ruthless private equity firm holding Todd's desperate bridge loan. The firm was large, aggressive, and entirely driven by profit. They held the exact chains that were currently wrapped around my son-in-law's neck. A dangerous idea began to form in my mind, an idea born from 40 years of outsmarting corporate sharks and building an invisible empire. I told Bradley to prepare the master accounts for Apex Holdings. We were not going to run from the predators. We were going to buy them. The sun rose over the highway, casting long gray shadows across the stained carpet of my motel room. I had spent the entire night analyzing the financial ruin Todd had brought upon himself. Bradley had given me the weapon to destroy their empire, but I needed more than just corporate leverage. A judge in a family court would still look at me as a father fighting his daughter. I needed undeniable proof of her malice to completely shatter the false narrative she had built. I needed to expose the absolute rot inside her mind, so that no legal authority would ever believe a single word she spoke again. I reached into my bag and pulled out the encrypted laptop. It was time to strip away the pristine suburban mask my daughter wore so proudly. I opened a secure communication channel and dialed a man named Daniel. Daniel was an independent digital security contractor who had performed corporate espionage sweeps for Apex Holdings over the past 10 years. He was brilliant, silent, and completely untethered from standard legal constraints. I did not bother explaining the family drama to him. I simply gave him Melissa's primary cellular number, her email addresses, and the make of her current smartphone. I told him I needed a complete mirror image of her personal cloud backup. I wanted every text message, every deleted photograph, every location pin, and every voice memo she had recorded over the past year. Daniel told me the security firewalls on modern consumer devices were tough, but people were lazy with their passwords. He said he would send me an encrypted drop link within 4 hours. Waiting is the most agonizing part of any structural demolition. You plant the charges, you wire the detonators, and then you simply sit in the silence, hoping your calculations are correct. I paced the small room, listening to the rumble of the trucks on the overpass outside. I thought about the little girl I had raised. I remembered paying for her piano lessons, her expensive college tuition, and the lavish wedding she demanded. I had spent my entire life shielding her from the harsh realities of the world. Now she was using the very resources I gave her to dig my grave. The father in me wanted to believe there was still some shred of remorse in her heart. The engineer in me knew that the foundation was already rotten and could not be saved. Exactly 4 hours later, my laptop chimed with a secure notification. Daniel had successfully breached her cloud account and bypassed the two-factor authentication by spoofing her device identification. He sent me a massive compressed file containing 50 gigabytes of my daughter's private digital life. I downloaded the archive and disconnected from the network. I opened the primary folder and began sorting through the endless directories of her existence. There were thousands of pictures showcasing expensive dinners, luxury vacations, and perfectly staged smiles. I ignored all of it. I ran a targeted search algorithm through the raw data, looking specifically for audio files and hidden voice memos. My search returned a hidden folder buried deep within a deleted application directory. Melissa had installed an automatic call recording application on her phone last year, likely to keep track of her arguments with contractors during her kitchen renovation. She had forgotten to disable it. The application had silently recorded and backed up hundreds of her private phone calls to the cloud. I arranged the audio files chronologically and filtered them by Todd's phone number. I put on a pair of noise-canceling headphones to block out the highway traffic. I clicked on a recording dated 3 weeks ago, right around the time they had started escalating my supposed medical crisis. The audio hissed to life in my ears. I heard the ambient noise of a car engine in the background. Todd was driving, and Melissa was on speakerphone. Todd sounded panicked and aggressive. He was complaining about the upcoming corporate audit and the pressure from his angry investors. He asked Melissa if the private equity firm had officially approved the bridge loan yet. Melissa told him to stop whining and trust her process. She said the forged medical documents from Dr. Bergman were completely foolproof, and the emergency conservatorship would be granted without any resistance. I sat perfectly still, listening to my own child casually discuss my legal execution as if she were planning a weekend getaway. But the conversation grew much darker. Todd asked what they were going to do with me after they took the money. He said he did not want me living in their house or taking up space in a nice private assisted living center, because those facilities cost $10,000 a month. He complained that keeping me comfortable would drain the inheritance they were trying to secure. Melissa let out a long, exasperated sigh. She told Todd he was being stupid for worrying about long-term costs. She said she had already picked out a state-run facility on the industrial side of the county. She described it as a dreary, underfunded warehouse for the forgotten elderly, where the staff barely spoke English and the conditions were absolutely miserable. Then she said the words that finally killed the last remaining ounce of love I held for her. Melissa lowered her voice and told Todd that the best part about this specific state-run facility was the fact that the turnover rate is extremely high. She said patients who go in there do not last very long, especially when they are heavily medicated. She let out a soft, cold laugh. Todd chuckled in agreement and said he hoped the turnover rate worked in their favor before the holidays, so they could take a trip to Europe without any loose ends. They were not just planning to steal my money. They were actively joking about my rapid deterioration and death in a miserable state facility so they could go on vacation. I took the headphones off and set them on the desk. My hands were not shaking. My breathing was completely steady. The profound sadness that had weighed on my chest for the past 2 days completely evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, titanium resolve. I exported the audio files onto a secure external drive. I now possessed the absolute proof of their premeditated malice. This recording would not just win a civil court case. It would guarantee that Melissa shared a federal prison cell right alongside her husband. Just as I was encrypting the external drive, my secure cellular phone vibrated across the wooden desk. I picked it up and saw Bradley Collins on the caller identification. It was highly unusual for Bradley to call me during the middle of the day unless the operational timeline had completely fractured. I answered the phone and his voice was tense. He did not bother with an introduction. He told me we had a massive problem and the entire board was shifting beneath our feet. Bradley explained that Melissa had not just been sitting quietly in her mansion after I confronted her in the kitchen yesterday. The moment I left her property, she drove directly to the local police precinct. She filed a sworn police report claiming that I had broken into her home in a state of severe psychiatric delusion. But she did not stop there. She lied to the detectives and told them I was acting violently aggressive. She claimed I had physically cornered her in the kitchen, screamed incoherent threats about burning her house to the ground, and implied that I was carrying a concealed weapon. She wept in front of the officers and begged them for protection from her insane, dangerous father. The police report was a tactical masterpiece of weaponized victimhood. Because I had no permanent residence and my accounts were frozen, the police classified me as a dangerous transient, experiencing a severe mental health crisis. Bradley told me that Melissa's aggressive legal team had immediately taken that police report straight out to Judge Mitchell Davis early this morning. They filed an emergency motion citing an immediate and lethal threat to the petitioner. They argued that if I was not permanently institutionalized right away, I was going to commit a violent tragedy. The judge did not ask for my side of the story. The legal system is designed to act first and ask questions later when physical violence is alleged by a sobbing daughter. Bradley delivered the final devastating blow. The judge had officially granted Melissa's emergency motion. The permanent conservatorship hearing was originally scheduled to take place at the end of the month, giving Apex Holdings plenty of time to finalize the buyout of Todd's private equity debt. But the schedule was completely destroyed. The judge had moved the hearing up to the absolute front of the docket. Bradley paused, letting the reality of the situation sink in. He told me the hearing was no longer weeks away. It was scheduled for this coming Thursday morning. I looked at the calendar on my laptop screen. That gave me exactly 48 hours. I had 48 hours before I was forced to stand in front of a judge who had already been primed to view me as a violent, demented threat. Apex Holdings needed at least 5 business days to legally purchase the private equity firm and take control of Todd's fraudulent loan. My weapon was not going to be ready in time. I was completely outmaneuvered. If I walked into that courtroom on Thursday morning without the corporate trap fully armed, Todd and Melissa would win. The judge would sign the order, the private equity money would hit Todd's account, and I would be dragged out of the courthouse in medical restraints. I was running out of time, and the walls of the trap were rapidly closing in. I hung up the phone and stared at the blinking neon light outside my window. I needed a miracle, or I needed to break the law. I packed the encrypted laptop and the master ledger back into my heavy leather duffel bag. I wiped down every surface in the cheap motel room, leaving absolutely no trace of my presence. Bradley had arranged my extraction with military precision. A black sedan with tinted windows idled silently behind the diner across the street from the motel. I walked through the damp night air carrying the weight of my stolen life and climbed into the back seat. The driver did not speak a single word to me. He simply put the car in gear and drove me directly to a small private airfield located on the desolate outskirts of the county. Bradley was already waiting on the dark tarmac, standing next to a sleek, twin-engine corporate jet. He handed me a secure leather folder containing a new government identification card and a completely fabricated medical history. For the next 3 days, I was no longer Richard Vernon. I was a man named Arthur Pendleton, a retired executive seeking a premium private cognitive evaluation. We boarded the jet, and the engines roared to life, lifting us rapidly into the dark night sky. I looked out the small cabin window, watching the glowing city lights of my home disappear below the thick clouds. My own daughter had weaponized the local courts and the local police force against me. She had trapped me in a legal jurisdiction where my actual name was now completely synonymous with violent insanity. To prove my absolute sanity to the world, I had to completely erase my identity and flee my home state like a wanted fugitive. It was a bitter and twisted irony, but engineers do not complain about the pull of gravity. They simply build structures capable of withstanding the crushing weight. We landed just before dawn in a neighboring state far outside the reach of my daughter and her corrupt legal network. A second private car drove us up a winding mountain road to a sprawling glass and steel medical complex hidden deep within an isolated pine forest. This was not a strip mall clinic or a corrupt psychiatrist office like the ones Melissa had dragged me to over the past 8 months. This was one of the most prestigious and exclusive neurological research institutes in the entire country. Their diagnostic reports were considered absolute, unassailable medical gospel in any federal or state courtroom across the nation. Bradley had leveraged significant corporate capital from Apex Holdings to completely bypass their standard 6-month waiting list and secure a highly confidential emergency evaluation. I walked through the automated glass doors into a pristine lobby that smelled of sterile alcohol and quiet, efficient authority. I was immediately greeted by the chief of neurology, a sharp, intelligent doctor who did not look at me with pity or fake sympathy. He looked at me like a complex machine that required a precise and objective diagnostic baseline. I handed him my forged identification, and he escorted me directly to a secure private research wing. For the next 72 hours, I was completely cut off from the outside world. There were no cellular phones allowed, no televisions, and absolutely no outside distractions. There was only the cold, clinical pursuit of the absolute truth. The testing began immediately, and it was brutally exhaustive. Melissa had relied on a fraudulent 10-minute video call to declare me legally incompetent and strip me of my human rights. The Institute required 3 consecutive days of rigorous intellectual, physical, and psychological trials to establish a true cognitive baseline. They placed me inside massive magnetic resonance imaging machines, for hours mapping the complex electrical pathways of my brain. They drew dozens of vials of blood testing for every conceivable metabolic anomaly, vitamin deficiency, and genetic marker associated with cognitive decline. I sat in a brightly lit examination room for hours, answering complex mathematical puzzles, spatial reasoning tests, and deep memory retention exercises. The neuropsychologists pushed my mind to its absolute limits, trying to find a single microscopic fracture in my cognitive foundation. They asked me to recite long random sequences of numbers backwards, to identify obscure visual patterns embedded in noise, and to solve complex logic equations under artificial time constraints designed to induce panic. I did not falter a single time. I leaned completely into the challenge. I approached every single test with the cold, calculating precision of a master civil engineer, analyzing a critical load-bearing blueprint. I had spent my entire life building massive bridges and towering skyscrapers that had to withstand earthquakes and hurricanes. A few psychological logic puzzles were not going to break me. I focused all my quiet rage and all my deep betrayal into a pure, razor-sharp concentration. Every correct answer I provided was a solid, heavy brick in the fortress I was currently building to crush my daughter. Every perfectly solved spatial equation was a permanent iron nail in her legal coffin. The doctors seemed increasingly surprised by my relentless speed and absolute accuracy, noting in their charts that my cognitive function was not just normal, but exceptionally high for a man of any age. I was outperforming their baseline metrics across every single category. On the late afternoon of the 3rd day, the chief of neurology called me and Bradley into his private, secure office. He sat down behind a large, polished oak desk and opened a thick, heavy medical file. He looked at me with a profound professional gravity that demanded absolute silence in the room. He stated categorically that there was absolutely no evidence of neurodegenerative disease, early onset dementia, or any form of cognitive decline. He turned the laptop screen toward me, showing the high-resolution scans of my brain. He told me the physical structures of my mind were pristine, and my memory retention was completely flawless. He officially declared that the fraudulent diagnosis provided by Dr. Bergman was medically impossible and scientifically absurd. But the neurologist did not stop there. He pulled out a separate sheet of paper printed on bright red laboratory stationery and placed it carefully on the desk. He explained that the exhaustive toxicological blood panels had uncovered something deeply concerning and highly dangerous. The laboratory technicians had found microscopic residual traces of a powerful synthetic chemical compound embedded deep within my fat cells. He read the long chemical name of the drug aloud. It was a heavy industrial-grade tranquilizer typically used in locked psychiatric wards to chemically subdue violently psychotic patients. It was an incredibly dangerous substance that was strictly regulated and absolutely not something a person could buy over the counter or accidentally ingest from a bad piece of food. The neurologist explained the severe side effects of the drug. He told me that prolonged daily exposure to this specific chemical would cause profound physical lethargy, severe memory fragmentation, temporary facial paralysis, and behavioral symptoms that completely mimicked the devastating effects of advanced dementia. He looked me directly in the eye and told me the terrifying truth. Someone had been systematically and intentionally poisoning me with heavy sedatives for months. The medical proof of her absolute evil was finally resting in my hands. The heavy sedatives, the supposedly healthy green vitamin pills Melissa had forced me to swallow every single morning, were now scientifically documented by the most respected medical institution in the country. The neurologist leaned forward and offered to contact the federal authorities immediately on my behalf. He stated with absolute conviction that this was a clear documented case of premeditated attempted murder and severe criminal elder abuse. I looked at the red laboratory report resting on the wooden desk. The emotional temptation to let him pick up the phone and make that call was incredibly overwhelming. If I went to the police right now, armed with this unassailable medical evidence, Melissa would be arrested before the sun went down. She would be ripped from her pristine suburban mansion in handcuffs, and the fraudulent conservatorship hearing would be instantly destroyed. The nightmare would legally end today. But the cold, strategic part of my mind, the silent architect who had survived decades of brutal corporate warfare, immediately saw the fatal structural flaw in that emotional reaction. If the police arrested Melissa today, the emergency court hearing scheduled for Thursday morning would be immediately canceled. Todd would instantly realize that his entire criminal scheme had collapsed. He would know that I was free and that his private equity bridge loan was never going to be funded. He would immediately panic and file for corporate bankruptcy to protect himself from his angry investors. He would run straight to the federal prosecutors and offer to testify against his own financial partners or even against my daughter to secure a plea deal and escape the trap. He would survive the fallout. He would lose his logistics company, but he would keep his freedom and his stolen, embezzled wealth safely hidden away in offshore shadow accounts. I could not allow that to happen. My goal was not simply to stop the theft of my estate. My goal was absolute and total annihilation of their entire false reality. I turned to the neurologist and politely declined his offer to call the federal authorities. I told him I was handling the situation privately through my corporate counsel, and that premature police involvement would complicate a sensitive financial matter. The doctor looked deeply shocked and slightly angry, but Bradley stepped in and smoothly secured the certified medical affidavits, signing the necessary non-disclosure agreements. We walked out of the pristine institute and back into the cold mountain air with the absolute scientific proof of my sanity and the weaponized evidence of her crime safely locked inside a heavy leather briefcase. The trap was now fully armed, but the timing of the detonation was absolutely critical. I had to maintain my silence and let them believe they were winning until the exact moment they had absolutely nothing left to lose. The flight back from the medical institute was incredibly quiet. I sat by the small window of the private jet and watched the dark landscape roll by far below. The heavy leather briefcase resting on the seat next to me contained the certified neurological reports and the toxicological evidence of my poisoning. I possessed the absolute medical proof of my sanity and the scientific documentation of my daughter's horrific crime. But proof is only useful if you have the time to present it. The emergency court hearing was rapidly approaching. Melissa and Todd had successfully manipulated the legal system to trap me in a corner. They believed I was completely defenseless. They believed my entire financial existence was contained within the $2 million retirement account they had convinced the judge to freeze. They were completely blinded by their own arrogance. That retirement account was nothing more than a carefully constructed decoy. When my wife was still alive, we watched her extended family tear themselves apart over a minor inheritance. I saw brothers permanently stop speaking to each other over a few $1,000s and a modest piece of property. I promised myself I would never let my own financial success become a poison to my daughter. So when I officially retired from my career as a civil engineer decades ago, I did not stop working. I quietly took my early investments and formed a blind holding company. I named it Apex Holdings. It was a commercial real estate entity that specialized entirely in acquiring distressed industrial properties and logistical supply chain centers. I built it from the ground up using proxy directors and ironclad trusts to ensure my name never appeared on any public corporate documents. I chose industrial real estate because it is completely invisible to the average person. Vain people buy shiny skyscrapers and luxury apartment buildings. Truly wealthy people buy the massive concrete warehouses that supply the entire region. Over 15 years, Apex Holdings grew into a massive corporate machine, generating tens of millions of dollars in annual revenue. Melissa thought I spent my retirement reading history books and fixing vintage cars in my garage. She had absolutely no idea that her father was the primary landlord for half the commercial shipping centers in the state. She assumed the $2 million in my personal bank account was the absolute ceiling of my wealth. Her ignorance was the exact vulnerability I was going to use to bury her husband. I opened my encrypted laptop as the jet began its final descent. Bradley sat across from me reviewing the financial dossier on the private equity firm holding Todd's desperate bridge loan. The firm was called Vanguard Capital Partners. They were ruthless financial predators who specialized in lending money to desperate men at astronomical interest rates. They demanded personal liberty and physical assets as collateral. Todd had signed a preliminary contract with them that guaranteed them the right to seize everything he owned if he failed to repay the loan. But Vanguard Capital Partners had a structural weakness of their own. Bradley had discovered that they were heavily over-leveraged in the commercial shipping sector. They desperately needed an immediate massive injection of liquid capital to satisfy their own institutional investors before the end of the fiscal quarter. I looked at Bradley and told him we were not going to try to block Todd's loan. I told him we were going to buy the entire debt portfolio from Vanguard Capital Partners. Bradley stared at me for a long moment. Purchasing a toxic debt portfolio from a major lending firm normally required months of intense negotiation, corporate audits, and legal due diligence. We had less than 48 hours before the court hearing. Bradley warned me that acquiring the paper that fast would require a massive hostile Taumal cash offer. We would have to bypass all standard corporate protocols and pay a premium so incredibly high that the senior partners at Vanguard could not legally refuse the acquisition. I told him I did not care about the premium. I was not buying a long-term investment. I was buying a guillotine. I authorized Bradley to unlock the primary corporate reserves of Apex Holdings. I instructed him to instantly wire $30 million into a secure escrow account to prove our absolute liquidity to the target firm. The moment the jet landed, Bradley immediately contacted the senior managing partners at Vanguard Capital Partners. He completely bypassed their junior analysts and went straight to the top executives. He offered to buy their entire high-risk lending portfolio, including the pending $1.5 million bridge loan contracted to my son-in-law. He offered them 20% above the absolute maximum market value of the entire portfolio. It was an obscene amount of money designed to paralyze their critical thinking. The only condition Bradley attached to the massive offer was that the legal transfer of ownership had to be finalized and fully executed before tomorrow night. The executives at Vanguard did not ask questions about the sudden windfall. When a phantom corporate entity offers you tens of millions of dollars above market value for a portfolio of toxic, high-risk debt, you do not hesitate. The greed of the financial predators made them incredibly predictable. They immediately agreed to the terms. Bradley drafted the acquisition contracts from the back seat of our tinted sedan while we drove through the dark, empty city streets. He worked with the cold mechanical efficiency of an executioner sharpening a blade. We needed to ensure that every single legal loophole was completely sealed. The contract stipulated that Apex Holdings would instantly assume absolute control over all collateral associated with the acquired loans. By the time the sun came up over the horizon, the legal framework was completely locked in place. The contracts were signed digitally by the proxy directors of both corporations and the massive transfer of corporate funds was officially authorized. I closed the laptop and watched the early morning light reflect off the towering city buildings. Melissa and Todd were currently waking up in their luxurious suburban mansion. They were likely drinking expensive coffee and rehearsing the terrible lies they were going to tell the judge on Thursday morning. They believed they were merely days away from becoming millionaires. They believed they had successfully caged a frail, demented old man. They had absolutely no idea that the tectonic plates of their reality had just violently shifted beneath their feet. I was no longer just the father they had betrayed. I was no longer the vulnerable victim they had chemically poisoned and locked out of his own home. Through the invisible, terrifying power of Apex Holdings, I was now the absolute legal owner of Vanguard Capital Partners' entire high-risk debt portfolio. The massive bridge loan Todd desperately needed to avoid federal prison was no longer controlled by anonymous corporate executives in a high-rise office. It was controlled entirely by me. I officially owned his debt. I owned the primary lien on his fraudulent logistics business. I held the absolute legal right to demand immediate repayment the exact second he defaulted on any of the terms. He had mortgaged his entire life to escape a federal prison cell, and he had unknowingly handed the only key directly to the man he was actively trying to destroy. The silent adjustment was complete. I had built the perfect invisible trap entirely out of his own financial desperation. But simply owning the debt was not enough to secure my absolute revenge. If I called in the loan right now, Todd would simply declare bankruptcy and avoid the immediate consequences. I needed him to stand in a court of law under oath and officially accept the money. I needed him to legally bind himself to the terms of the loan in front of a judge so he could never escape the financial devastation that was about to follow. The counterstrike was fully armed, and I was finally ready to face my daughter in the courtroom. The emergency legal motion my daughter filed contained a very specific and highly dangerous trap. Because Judge Davis had granted the temporary injunction based on her fabricated police report, the court had officially mandated a psychiatric welfare check. I received a stern voicemail on my monitored phone from a state-appointed social worker. She stated that I was legally required to meet her at a neutral municipal building on Wednesday afternoon. The purpose of this meeting was to conduct an immediate preliminary assessment of my living conditions and my baseline mental stability before the final hearing on Thursday morning. The social worker warned me that failing to appear would be entered into the official court record as undeniable proof of my severe cognitive decline, my erratic behavior, and my inability to follow basic legal instructions. A normal man fighting a desperate defensive war would have rushed to that appointment. A normal man would have sat across from that social worker in a brightly lit government office, speaking calmly and politely, desperately, trying to prove he was perfectly sane. But I was no longer fighting a defensive war. I was the invisible architect of their absolute ruin. I knew that if I showed up and easily passed her basic psychological evaluation, it might cause the judge to hesitate. It might cause a slight delay in the Thursday morning hearing while the court ordered more tests. I absolutely did not want a delay. A delay would give Todd time to reconsider his massive fraudulent loan. I needed Todd and Melissa to feel completely invincible. I needed them to walk into that courtroom tomorrow morning, blinded by their own arrogant certainty. So I turned my monitored phone completely off. I sat in the hard wooden chair of my cheap motel room and watched the red numbers on the digital clock slowly tick past the scheduled meeting time. I deliberately violated a direct court order. I intentionally gave them the exact ammunition they thought they needed to destroy me. By Wednesday evening, the trap was perfectly baited. Melissa believed she had me completely cornered. The social worker had undoubtedly reported my absence directly to the judge and to my daughter's aggressive legal team. In Melissa's mind, my failure to appear was the final absolute nail in my coffin. She had won, and because she possessed the deeply toxic need to play the victim, she could not resist the urge to gloat under the guise of fake compassion. She sent a text message to my phone knowing full well that the court would eventually review our digital communications. The message she sent was a masterpiece of manufactured sympathy and calculated legal posturing. She wrote that she had just heard I missed my mandatory appointment with the social worker today. She said she was so incredibly worried about my deteriorating mind and my safety out on the streets all alone. She promised me that after the hearing tomorrow, she would make sure I was put in a safe medical facility where I could not wander off or hurt myself ever again. She ended the message by saying she loved me so much, and that this broke her heart. It was utterly sickening to read. It was a flawless performance, designed entirely for the legal record, ensuring the judge would look at her tomorrow and see a heartbroken, devoted daughter dealing with an insane, wandering father. I sat in the dim light of the motel room and looked at the glowing screen for a long time. I did not type out a massive, angry paragraph exposing her lies. I did not threaten her or tell her I knew about the poisoned vitamins. I did not give her a single ounce of my actual energy. I simply typed a single word. Okay. I hit send. That single word was the absolute loudest silence I could possibly project. It told her I was completely exhausted. It told her I was confused and defeated. It told her I was finally surrendering to the inevitable reality she had constructed. It gave her the absolute false security she desperately craved, to sleep soundly that night. While my daughter was playing psychological games on her phone sealing her own legal fate, Todd was sealing his permanent financial doom. Bradley Collins was actively monitoring the secure digital administrative portals of Vanguard Capital Partners, which was now a wholly owned subsidiary of Apex Holdings. We had a direct, real-time view into the predatory lending system. Todd had just received the automated digital notification that his massive bridge loan of $1.5 million had been officially approved and was ready for final execution. Todd drove his expensive, leased luxury car to a sleek, high-rise building downtown to meet with the local loan officers. He walked into the glass conference room, wearing a perfectly tailored designer suit, projecting the absolute image of a highly successful logistics chief executive officer. He sat down at the heavy oak conference table and picked up a silver pen. He did not bother to read the new corporate disclosures attached to the digital file. Arrogant men never read the fine print when they are desperate and believe they are winning. He did not see the tiny legal clauses indicating that the parent company of the lending firm had changed hands overnight. He only saw the massive sum of money waiting to rescue him from his federal embezzlement charges. The terms of the bridge loan he was signing were absolutely brutal. Because Todd had no legitimate corporate assets left to leverage, he had to offer massive personal collateral to secure the capital. Bradley watched the digital signatures register in real time on our encrypted system. Todd signed the first page legally binding his pristine suburban mansion to the debt. He signed the second page attaching every single piece of jewelry his wife owned, every luxury vehicle in their driveway, and every future drop of legitimate income he would ever earn. He signed the third page completely waiving his right to a standard legal foreclosure process if he defaulted on the payments. He was legally agreeing to immediate and absolute asset seizure without any court intervention or legal defense. He was literally signing his entire physical existence away to a shadow corporation. And his final piece of collateral, the core guarantee that made the entire predatory loan possible, was his sworn legal statement that his wife was exactly 12 hours away from gaining absolute legal control of Richard Vernon's $2 million estate. He guaranteed the loan with my money. He signed his name with a confident flourish. He stood up and shook the hands of the loan officers. He smiled his perfect rehearsed smile, completely unaware that he had just handed the absolute master key to his entire life directly to the man he was currently trying to lock in a psychiatric ward. The loan documents were fully executed, legally sealed, and permanently binding. Bradley sent me the finalized digital copies directly to my laptop. I stared at Todd's signature glowing on the screen. The trap was now fully locked. There was absolutely no way out for him. He was legally chained to a massive debt he could never possibly repay without liquidating my personal retirement accounts. But the money was not released to him yet. The $1.5 million was currently sitting in a locked, secure escrow account controlled entirely by Apex Holdings. The final execution clause of the contract was incredibly clear and incredibly dangerous. The massive funds would automatically transfer into Todd's corporate bank account the exact minute Judge Mitchell Davis signed the final permanent conservatorship order tomorrow morning. Todd's freedom from federal prison, his marriage, his mansion, and his entire life now hinged entirely on winning that court case. He had pushed all of his stolen chips into the center of the table. He was betting his absolute existence on proving my insanity to a family court judge. If he won, he got the money and survived. If he lost, he was legally bound to a predatory loan he could not pay his house, would be instantly seized by my corporation, and the federal auditors would discover his massive embezzlement the very next week. The sun finally set on Wednesday evening, casting long, dark shadows across the cheap motel room. I closed my encrypted laptop and packed it carefully into my heavy leather bag. I walked over to the small closet and laid out the cheap, wrinkled suit I had worn the day the process server ambushed me on my porch. I needed to look exactly the way they expected me to look tomorrow. I needed to look frail, tired, and utterly defeated. The corporate board was perfectly set. The financial predators were starving for their money, the bait was fully taken by my arrogant family, and the invisible guillotine was raised to the absolute highest point. All that was left to do was let the blade drop. The final countdown to the courtroom had begun. The heavy rain lashed against the thin glass of my motel window, washing away the grime of the city streets. It was Wednesday night, the final hours before the courtroom battle. I sat alone at the small wooden desk, illuminated only by the harsh yellow light of a single exposed bulb. The room smelled of old dust and cheap cleaning chemicals. Spread out before me were 3 massive leather binders. Bradley Collins had delivered them an hour ago under the cover of darkness. He walked into the motel room completely silent and placed the weapons of my daughter's destruction directly into my hands. I ran my fingers over the thick stacks of heavy legal paper. I was wearing the cheap, wrinkled gray suit I planned to wear to the hearing tomorrow. I needed to feel the rough fabric against my skin. I needed to fully embrace the physical disguise of the frail, defeated old man they so desperately expected to see. I opened the first binder. It contained the finalized acquisition records of Vanguard Capital Partners. Seeing my hidden corporate entity listed as the absolute legal owner of their predatory debt brought a cold, familiar memory to the surface of my mind. I had not always been this calculating. I had not always viewed the world through the lens of absolute leverage. In the late 1990s, I was a naive structural engineer trying to launch my first independent construction firm. I had partnered with a man named David, who I trusted like a biological brother. We spent 2 years bidding on contracts and finally won a massive municipal project to build a regional transit hub. I thought we were building an empire together, but David was secretly funneling our corporate operating capital into his own private shadow accounts. He left my firm entirely exposed to our material suppliers and our creditors. He intentionally tried to force me into personal bankruptcy so he could buy my shares for absolute pennies and take sole credit for the transit project. He almost succeeded. I spent weeks staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, wondering how someone I loved could look me in the eye and steal my livelihood. But David made one fatal miscalculation. He focused entirely on the liquid cash inside the company bank accounts, and he completely ignored the physical assets. He did not know that months prior I had quietly purchased the actual commercial land situated directly beneath the transit hub project using a blind trust. When he finally tried to lock me out of our own company headquarters, I simply locked him out of the massive construction site. I legally evicted his work crews and seized all the heavy machinery stationed on my property. He lost everything in a single day because he forgot the most fundamental rule of structural engineering. You must always own the solid ground your enemies walk on. That brutal betrayal in the 1990s fundamentally changed me. It taught me that blind trust is a dangerous liability, and that absolute financial leverage is the only true security in this world. I built Apex Holdings entirely on that exact philosophy. I spent the next 3 decades quietly buying the concrete foundations of the commercial world. I ensured that no partner, no competitor, and no bank could ever pull the earth from beneath my feet again. Now sitting in this dark motel room, I was forced to apply that exact same ruthless corporate doctrine to my own flesh and blood. Melissa thought she was fighting a lonely retired old man who forgot to turn off his kitchen stove. She did not realize she had declared war on the invisible architect who had spent 30 years learning how to completely dismantle his enemies from the ground up. I pushed the first binder aside and opened the second. This binder contained the exact predatory loan contract Todd had executed just a few hours ago at the high-rise downtown. The digital ink on his signature was practically glowing on the printed page. I flipped past the standard lending terms and turned directly to the final section of the contract. This was the immediate execution clause Todd had blindly signed in his desperate rush to secure the $1.5 million. Because he possessed no legitimate corporate assets, he had been forced to waive every standard consumer protection right. He had legally waived his right to a standard 30-day foreclosure notice. He had agreed to an immediate and absolute asset seizure in the event of any material misrepresentation of his collateral. His entire multi-million-dollar loan was guaranteed by a single fatal promise. He had guaranteed the financial predators that his wife would legally control my $2 million estate by tomorrow morning. He had attached the forged psychiatric evaluation from Dr. Bergman as absolute proof of his claim. But I held the certified neurological reports from the National Institute proving that her entire legal petition was a massive documented fraud. That meant Todd had officially secured a massive loan using entirely fraudulent and criminal collateral. Under the brutal, ironclad terms of his own signed contract that constituted an immediate, unforgivable default of the loan. I took a heavy silver pen from my inside jacket pocket. I turned to the final pages of the binder. These were the corporate asset seizure authorization forms. These were the lethal legal documents that would instantly strip Todd of his pristine suburban mansion, his leased luxury cars, and his remaining corporate bank accounts. I pressed the tip of the pen to the thick paper. I did not hesitate for a single second. My hand did not shake. I signed my true legal name with absolute steady precision, but I did not date the legal documents for Wednesday night. I looked at the digital clock glowing on the bedside table. I wrote the date of tomorrow. Then I wrote the exact time. 9:00 in the morning. I deliberately post-dated my signature to legally activate the exact minute Judge Mitchell Davis was scheduled to bang his wooden gavel and open the emergency conservatorship hearing. The poetry of the execution was mathematically perfect. Melissa had ambushed me with a legal eviction notice while I was repairing my front porch. I was going to legally evict her from her own life while she was sitting confidently in a court of law. By signing these documents, I authorized Bradley Collins to dispatch a private security team to their upscale gated community the moment the clock struck 9. While Melissa was weeping fake tears in front of the judge, my corporate agents would be drilling out the locks on her custom mahogany front door. While Todd was whispering arrogant comments in the courtroom gallery, my security team would be towing his expensive vehicles out of his pristine driveway. They were going to walk out of that courthouse completely homeless and absolutely destitute. They were going to experience the exact same terrifying shock of displacement they had so casually inflicted upon me. I opened the third and final binder. This contained the certified toxicological reports proving Melissa had been intentionally poisoning me with heavy industrial sedatives. It contained the digital audio transcripts of her laughing about putting me in a miserable state-run facility with a high mortality rate. This was the criminal anvil I was going to drop on them after the financial floor collapsed beneath their feet. I placed the 3 binders carefully into my heavy leather duffel bag. I zipped the bag shut and placed it next to the door. The trap was completely flawless and fully armed. When Todd and Melissa walked into that courtroom tomorrow, they would genuinely believe they were stepping into their final glorious victory. They would expect to walk out as wealthy, powerful masters of my domain. They would have no idea that the exact moment they sat down in front of the judge, their massive house would legally belong to me. They would not know that the massive bridge loan they desperately needed to avoid federal prison was never going to arrive. I stood up from the wooden desk and looked at my reflection in the cheap, cracked mirror hanging above the motel sink. The man looking back at me looked old, tired, broken, and thoroughly confused. It was the perfect visual disguise. I took a deep breath and let the cold reality of the situation settle into my bones. The loving father who had happily paid for Melissa to have a beautiful wedding was officially dead. The man who had loaned Todd $500,000 out of the kindness of his heart no longer existed. The man going to court tomorrow was simply the corporate landlord of their complete destruction. I walked over to the desk and turned off the harsh yellow light. I lay down on the stiff mattress in the dark room, listening to the heavy rain beat against the roof. I closed my eyes and waited for the morning sun. I was absolutely ready to face the monsters I had unknowingly created and burn their stolen empire straight to the ground. The morning air was unseasonably cold for a Thursday. I stood on the concrete steps of the county courthouse and looked up at the towering stone columns. This was the arena my daughter had chosen for my execution. I had spent the last 3 days moving completely unseen through the highest levels of corporate finance and private medical research. Now I had to physically shrink myself down to fit the pathetic mold they had created for me. I wore the cheap gray suit I had laid out the night before. I had not ironed it. I intentionally wore a shirt with a slightly frayed collar and shoes that lacked their usual polish. I did not stand with the straight, rigid posture of a civil engineer. I allowed my shoulders to slump forward. I let my hands tremble just slightly as I reached for the heavy brass handle of the courthouse doors. The lobby was a chaotic echo chamber of desperate people fighting over broken promises and shattered families. I walked slowly through the metal detectors, playing the part of a confused, vulnerable elder. I found the directory board and traced my finger along the glass until I found the courtroom assigned to Judge Mitchell Davis. It was located on the 4th floor at the very end of a long fluorescent hallway. I took the elevator up, standing silently in the corner, while 2 young attorneys loudly discussed their weekend plans. They did not even look at me. In a place built entirely on power and leverage, a frail old man in a wrinkled suit is completely invisible. That invisibility was my greatest tactical advantage. I stepped off the elevator and walked down the polished linoleum corridor. I found a hard wooden bench situated directly outside the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. I sat down and rested my hands on my knees. I stared at the large analog clock mounted on the wall above the doors. It was 8:30 in the morning. I had exactly 30 minutes before the legal demolition of my daughter's life began. 30 minutes until my corporate security team drilled through the locks of her pristine mansion. I focused entirely on the steady, sweeping motion of the second hand. The elevator down the hall chimed loudly. I did not turn my head, but I could hear the sharp, rhythmic clicking of expensive heels on the hard floor. It was a sound that commanded attention and demanded space. Melissa and Todd had arrived. They were not alone. They moved down the hallway like a conquering royal procession. Melissa was wearing a tailored dark navy dress that cost more than the average person makes in a month. She had styled her hair with meticulous care to project the image of a serious, responsible professional who was tragically burdened by her father's failing mind. Todd walked beside her wearing a custom-fitted charcoal suit, a silk tie, and a gold watch he had undoubtedly purchased with embezzled investor funds. They were flanked by 3 highly aggressive private attorneys. These were not public defenders or small-town family lawyers. These were expensive legal mercenaries dressed in immaculate pinstripes, carrying thick leather briefcases. They walked with their chests puffed out, completely dominating the narrow hallway. They were laughing about a golf game as they approached the courtroom doors. They were so absolutely certain of their victory today that they were treating my legal execution like a casual morning coffee meeting. Melissa saw me sitting alone on the wooden bench. Her laughter instantly vanished. She stopped walking and stared at me. For a brief second, I saw a flicker of genuine shock in her eyes. I knew exactly what she was thinking. She had fully expected me to be ranting and raving in the hallway. She had expected the police to be holding me back, or the social worker to be desperately trying to calm me down. She had heavily relied on my supposed erratic aggression to prove her case. Instead, she found a quiet, broken old man staring blankly at the floor. But the shock quickly morphed into a deep, toxic satisfaction. She looked at my wrinkled suit and my slumped shoulders. She smiled a tight, cruel smile. She honestly believed her psychological warfare had finally broken my spirit. Her lead attorney, a tall man with slicked back hair and a predatory gaze, leaned down and whispered something in her ear. He did not even bother to lower his voice completely. He told her not to worry, because I looked completely compliant, and the judge would process the conservatorship in 10 minutes. The lawyers did not look at me as a human being. They looked at me as a minor bureaucratic hurdle they needed to clear before they collected their massive legal fees. They turned their backs to me and began organizing their forged medical files on a small wooden table near the courtroom entrance. Todd separated himself from the group of lawyers. He walked slowly toward my bench. He stood directly over me, casting a long dark shadow across my lap. He did not sit down. He wanted to maintain the physical high ground. He wanted me to feel the crushing weight of his absolute authority. I kept my head bowed and stared silently at his shoes. They were Italian leather, completely spotless and incredibly expensive. They were the shoes of a man who believed he owned the entire world. Todd leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees, so his face was only inches from mine. I could smell the strong, expensive cologne he wore. He spoke in a voice that was perfectly modulated to sound gentle to anyone passing by, but the words he used were laced with pure venom. He told me it was a real shame I had skipped my appointment with the social worker yesterday. He said my absence had made their job incredibly easy. He whispered that the judge was going to strip away my fundamental rights the second we walked through those oak doors. I did not react. I did not clench my jaw or tighten my fists. I remained perfectly still, letting him pour his arrogant poison directly into the air between us. Todd interpreted my silence as absolute submission. His voice grew slightly louder, vibrating with a sick, greedy excitement. He told me he was going to take immediate control of my $2 million retirement account the moment the ink dried on the court order. He leaned closer and whispered that he was already planning a massive luxury vacation to the southern coast of France for him and Melissa. He said he was going to enjoy spending every single penny I had worked my entire life to save. He did not stop there. The cruelty of a desperate man who thinks he has won knows no absolute bounds. He told me he had already finalized the paperwork for the state-run memory care facility. He used the exact same words I had heard on the hidden audio recording. He called it a miserable, underfunded warehouse. He whispered that I was going to rot in a room that smelled of bleach and despair, surrounded by people who could not even remember their own names. He smiled directly into my face and said he would make sure the nurses heavily medicated me so I would not cause any trouble. He promised he would never come to visit me. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the shiny leather of his Italian shoes. I was running a massive, complex calculation in my mind. Todd believed those shoes belonged to him. He believed the expensive charcoal suit he was wearing belonged to him. He believed the mansion he had slept in last night and the luxury car he drove to the courthouse this morning belonged to him. He was completely oblivious to the massive invisible financial web that was currently tightening around his throat. Because I had legally purchased the massive private equity debt portfolio overnight through Apex Holdings, Todd was no longer a free man. Every single physical asset he claimed to own was now legally pledged to my corporation. The contract he had blindly signed yesterday gave me the absolute right to seize his property without warning if he presented fraudulent collateral. And the forged psychiatric evaluation sitting in his lawyer's briefcase was the ultimate proof of that fraud. I stared at his shoes and felt a profound sense of absolute calm. It is a rare and terrifying thing to look at a man and know exactly when his life is going to end. I did not need to scream at him or defend my honor in the hallway. I did not need to tell him that my corporate security agents were currently pulling into his neighborhood with a fleet of moving trucks and heavy drilling equipment. I did not need to warn him that the $30 million corporation he thought was a faceless lending institution was actually controlled by the old man sitting quietly on the wooden bench. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom suddenly clicked open. A uniformed bailiff stepped out into the hallway holding a thick clipboard. He called out the case name with a loud, booming voice that echoed off the hard stone walls. He announced the matter of the emergency conservatorship for Richard Vernon. He instructed all parties to enter the courtroom and take their seats. Todd stood up straight and adjusted the knot of his expensive silk tie. He looked down at me one final time with a look of absolute disgust. He told me it was time to say goodbye to my life. He turned around and walked confidently toward the courtroom doors, joining Melissa and their aggressive legal team. They walked through the doors together, a united front of pure greed and completely manufactured righteousness. I waited for them to enter before I slowly pushed myself up from the hard wooden bench. I smoothed the lapels of my wrinkled suit. I looked up at the wall clock one last time. It was exactly 8:55 in the morning. I had 5 minutes left until the permanent financial detonation. I took a deep, slow breath and walked toward the open courtroom doors. I was ready to step into the light and completely obliterate the darkness they had built. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom clicked entirely shut, sealing us inside the legal arena. The chaotic noise of the crowded hallway instantly vanished, replaced by the thick, suffocating silence of judicial authority. Judge Mitchell Davis entered from his private chambers behind the elevated wooden bench. He was a stern-looking man with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed absolutely nothing. The bailiff ordered everyone to stand and then instructed us to take our seats. I sat alone at the respondent table. I did not bring a thick stack of papers. I did not have an aggressive lawyer sitting next to me ready to object. Bradley Collins was sitting quietly in the very back row of the public gallery, completely blending in with the law students and curious onlookers. I had specifically instructed him to remain entirely invisible until the absolute maximum level of damage had been inflicted by their lies. The visual dynamic of the courtroom was completely skewed by design. At the petitioner table, Melissa and Todd sat perfectly upright, flanked by their 3 expensive legal mercenaries. Their table was covered in thick, organized binders and pristine legal pads. My table was completely empty. Judge Davis looked down through his reading glasses and noted my apparent lack of legal representation. He asked me directly if I intended to represent myself in such a grave and complex legal matter. I stood up slowly, allowing my shoulders to sag. I kept my voice soft and slightly hesitant. I told him that I did not understand why I needed a lawyer to talk to my own daughter. Judge Davis let out a long, heavy sigh. He shook his head slightly. My performance played perfectly into the exact narrative they had painstakingly built. I looked exactly like a confused, frightened old man who fundamentally failed to grasp the terrifying reality of his own situation. The judge instructed the prosecution to begin their opening statements. Melissa's lead attorney immediately stood up. He buttoned his expensive tailored jacket and walked confidently to the center wooden podium. He possessed the smooth, booming voice of a man who was incredibly accustomed to winning. He did not begin with anger or aggression. He began with a deeply manufactured sense of profound sorrow. The attorney addressed the court by stating that today was a day of absolute familial tragedy. He painted a masterful verbal portrait of my past. He described me as a once brilliant and highly capable civil engineer who had built a wonderful life for his family. But then his voice dropped an entire octave. He told the judge that the brilliant man I used to be was completely gone. He claimed my mind had been violently ravaged by an aggressive, irreversible neurological disease. He pointed a long finger directly at me and stated that the man sitting alone at the table was completely detached from reality and a severe danger to himself and the general public. He wasted absolutely no time weaponizing my intentional absence from yesterday. He submitted a formal document to the court clerk detailing my failure to attend the mandatory psychiatric welfare check with the state-appointed social worker. The attorney leaned heavily on the wooden podium and told the judge that this was not a simple scheduling mistake. He called it a reckless and terrifying display of cognitive collapse. He argued that a man who cannot even remember to attend a court-ordered meeting regarding his own freedom is a man who is completely incapable of managing his physical survival or his financial independence. The attorney then expertly pivoted to the primary target of their entire criminal conspiracy: the money. He submitted a thick financial dossier outlining the exact value of my entire life savings. He meticulously detailed the $2 million retirement portfolio, the fully paid-off suburban home, and the vintage car collection resting in my garage. He spoke about these assets as if they were already sitting in Melissa's bank account. He warned the judge that these millions of dollars were in immediate critical danger of being completely squandered or destroyed by my failing mind. He claimed that Melissa was stepping forward, putting her own life on hold out of pure, selfless filial duty to protect her father's legacy from his own tragic deterioration. With the financial stakes officially logged into the court record, the attorney called his primary witness. He called my daughter to the stand. Melissa stood up slowly from her chair. She smoothed the fabric of her tailored navy dress and walked toward the wooden witness box with her head bowed in a perfect display of manufactured grief. She placed her right hand on the Bible and swore a sacred oath to tell the absolute truth. The moment she sat down, the theatrical performance truly began. She looked across the room directly at me. Her eyes immediately welled up with tears. She let out a soft, audible sob that echoed in the silent courtroom. Melissa began to weave a massive, intricate tapestry of absolute lies. She told the judge a fabricated story about a night she supposedly came to visit me and found the heavy iron gas stove burning unattended. She described the imaginary terror she felt when she smelled the toxic fumes filling the kitchen. She cried real tears as she described how she had to physically pull me out of the house while I mumbled incoherently. None of this ever happened, but she spoke with such intense emotional conviction that even a seasoned detective would have believed her. She did not stop with the fire hazard. She moved on to the destruction of our personal relationship. She wiped her eyes with a tissue and told the judge that last month I had looked directly at her husband Todd and demanded to know who he was. She claimed I had become violently paranoid and unpredictable. She specifically referenced the false police report she had filed earlier this week. She painted a horrifying picture of a delusional old man cornering his terrified daughter in a kitchen, screaming threats about burning her house to the ground. She portrayed herself as a desperately loving child who had tried everything to care for her father in his own home but had finally been overwhelmed by his aggressive insanity. She paused her testimony to take a trembling breath. It was an Oscar-worthy display of weaponized emotion. She looked up at Judge Davis and told him that taking her own father to court was the absolute hardest and most painful decision she had ever made in her entire life. She claimed it broke her heart into a million pieces to see the strong, proud man who raised her reduced to a confused, angry shell of a human being. She begged the judge to grant the permanent conservatorship immediately. She promised the court under oath that she had already secured a highly specialized medical facility where I would receive the best round-the-clock care possible. I sat silently listening to her use the word care, knowing full well she was referring to the miserable underfunded state warehouse she had laughed about on the hidden audio recording. The emotional manipulation was incredibly effective. I watched Judge Davis lean forward in his high leather chair. His stern expression completely softened. He looked at Melissa with deep, genuine sympathy. He saw a burdened, heartbroken woman trying to do the right thing for a sick father. The lead attorney recognized that the judge was completely captivated. He stepped away from the podium and prepared to deliver the final lethal blow. He reached into his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a pristine white envelope. He removed the sworn psychiatric affidavit signed by Dr. Bergman. The attorney handed the original notarized document to the courtroom bailiff, who carried it up to the judge's bench. The lawyer did not simply let the judge read it in silence. He read the devastating medical conclusions aloud, ensuring every single word was permanently entered into the acoustic record of the courtroom. He read that Dr. Bergman, a licensed and respected psychiatric specialist, had personally evaluated Richard Vernon and found severe, irreversible neurodegenerative disease. The lawyer placed heavy, terrifying emphasis on the words, severe and irreversible. He continued reading the fraudulent clinical notes. He recited the doctor's official medical recommendation that the patient be immediately stripped of all legal, financial, and medical autonomy. The attorney raised his voice, filling the room with absolute manufactured authority. He stated categorically that this proceeding was no longer a simple family dispute over living arrangements. He declared it a documented critical medical emergency. He demanded that the court immediately grant Melissa permanent and absolute legal control over my physical body and my entire $2 million estate. He argued that the funds must be instantly released to her control to secure my safety and to pay for my expensive long-term institutionalization. The attorney closed his legal folder with a sharp, loud snap. He stated that the petitioner rested her case. He walked back to his table and sat down, looking incredibly satisfied. Melissa stepped down from the witness box and walked slowly back to her chair. She sat down next to Todd. Todd gently placed his arm around her shoulders and rubbed her back, playing the role of the devoted, supportive husband flawlessly. They had executed their entire criminal conspiracy without a single structural flaw. They had presented a cohesive, emotionally devastating, and medically documented argument that completely justified my legal execution. The invisible trap had snapped completely shut around me. They had laid all their stolen cards on the table. The judge turned his attention away from their pristine legal team and looked directly down at my empty table. He looked at my wrinkled gray suit and my slumped posture. He addressed me with a mixture of profound pity and slight administrative impatience. He asked me if I had anything to say in my own defense before he rendered his final ruling and signed the permanent conservatorship order. He fully expected me to rant, to shout wildly about conspiracies, or to babble incoherently. He expected me to validate every single lie my daughter had just told. I remained completely silent for a long, heavy moment, absorbing the absolute weight of their arrogance. The board was perfectly set, and they had absolutely no idea that the silent adjustment was about to tear their entire world apart. The heavy silence in the courtroom felt absolute. Judge Mitchell Davis leaned over his elevated wooden desk, waiting for my response. He looked at me with the gentle patience one reserves for a frightened child. Melissa sat at the petitioner table, dabbing her dry eyes with a white tissue. Todd sat beside her with his arms casually resting on the armrests, radiating a quiet, arrogant certainty. Their expensive legal team watched me with expressions of utter boredom. They had delivered their flawless theatrical performance, and now they were simply waiting for the inevitable surrender. They fully expected me to mumble an incoherent defense or to fly into a paranoid rage that would perfectly validate their entire fabricated case. I did not raise my voice. I did not begin to shout or plead for mercy. I simply took a deep breath and let the physical disguise fall away completely. I straightened my spine, pushing my shoulders back. I lifted my chin and looked Judge Davis directly in the eye with the cold, piercing focus of a master engineer inspecting a severely flawed blueprint. The subtle shift in my physical posture was instantaneous and striking. The frail, broken old man they had dragged into this room vanished into thin air. I spoke with a clear, steady, and commanding voice that echoed sharply off the hard stone walls. I told the judge that while I was fully capable of defending my own mental competency, I preferred to let my corporate counsel handle the formal legal submissions. Before the judge could even process the sudden change in my demeanor, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Bradley Collins stood up from his seat in the back row of the public gallery. He walked down the center aisle with the slow, measured steps of an absolute apex predator entering a cage full of frightened animals. He was wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue suit that made the expensive outfits of Melissa's legal team look cheap by comparison. He carried a single thick black leather binder. The entire courtroom turned to watch him approach the wooden gate that separated the gallery from the legal tables. Melissa's lead attorney immediately jumped to his feet. His face flushed red with sudden confusion and anger. He pointed a finger at Bradley and loudly objected to his presence. He told the judge that the respondent was a medically documented victim of severe neurodegenerative disease and was therefore entirely legally incompetent to hire outside counsel. He demanded that Bradley be removed from the courtroom immediately so the conservatorship order could be finalized. Bradley did not even look at the opposing lawyer. He walked through the wooden gate and approached the judge's bench. He spoke with a calm, lethal authority that instantly commanded the entire room. He officially introduced himself as the primary corporate attorney and legal representative for Mr. Richard Vernon. He informed the judge that the opposing counsel was operating under a foundation of absolute medical fiction. He stated that he was not here to argue about my mental state. He was here to present unassailable scientific fact. Judge Davis held up his hand, demanding silence from Melissa's panicked legal team. He looked at Bradley with a mixture of intense curiosity and deep judicial suspicion. He asked Bradley what exactly he intended to submit to the court that could possibly counter the sworn psychiatric affidavit already entered into the official record. Bradley placed the thick black leather binder directly onto the judge's elevated desk. The heavy thud of the binder hitting the wood sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. Bradley announced that he was submitting the comprehensive results of a 3-day exhaustive neurological and cognitive evaluation. He specified that this evaluation was not conducted over a 10-minute remote video call by a private doctor with a history of questionable billing practices. He stated that this examination was performed entirely in person at the premier National Neurological Research Institute in the country. He read the names of the 3 independent board-certified neurosurgeons and cognitive specialists who had personally overseen the testing. The color instantly drained from Melissa's face. The tissue slipped from her fingers and fell onto the table. Todd gripped the armrests of his chair so hard his knuckles turned completely white. They had built their entire criminal conspiracy on the assumption that I was isolated, trapped, and completely incapable of defending myself. They had absolutely no idea that I possessed the resources to fly across state lines and secure the most prestigious medical defense on the entire continent. Bradley opened the binder for the judge. He did not rely on emotional appeals or theatrical tears. He relied purely on ruthless documented data. He guided the judge through the high-resolution brain scans, proving the complete absence of any physical deterioration. He pointed to the flawless scores from the intensive psychological stress tests. He read the final sworn conclusion signed by the chief of neurology. The conclusion explicitly stated that Richard Vernon possessed exceptional cognitive function, perfect memory retention, and absolute mental clarity. The courtroom remained deathly silent as Judge Davis read the documents. He flipped through the pages reading the pristine medical data from an institution whose reputation was completely beyond reproach. The atmosphere in the room shifted violently. the sympathetic warmth that had filled the judge's eyes while he listened to Melissa's tearful testimony completely evaporated. It was rapidly replaced by a cold, terrifying judicial fury. A judge is the ultimate master of his courtroom, and there is nothing a judge hates more than realizing he has been deliberately manipulated and lied to by a weeping witness. Judge Davis looked up from the black binder and stared directly at Melissa's lead attorney. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. He held up the fraudulent affidavit signed by Dr. Bergman. He asked the opposing counsel if he was absolutely certain about the origin and the validity of this specific medical document. The aggressive lawyer who had been booming with confidence just 10 minutes ago suddenly looked incredibly small. He stammered slightly, trying to defend the document. He claimed his firm had relied on the medical professionals provided by the petitioner. He was already trying to legally distance himself from my daughter. Bradley did not give them a single second to recover. He stepped forward and delivered the next crushing blow. He formally requested that Judge Davis strike the fraudulent affidavit from the official court record entirely. But he went even further. He formally requested that the court immediately forward Dr. Bergman's forged evaluation to the State Medical Licensing Board and to the District Attorney's Office for an immediate criminal investigation into severe medical fraud and perjury. Melissa let out a sharp, terrified gasp. She looked at Todd with wide, panicked eyes. Her beautiful, pristine mask was completely shattering. She realized that the weapon she had used to try and destroy my life was now being turned directly against her and her corrupt accomplices. If the district attorney investigated Dr. Bergman, the doctor would instantly turn on Melissa to save his own medical license. He would testify that she had paid him to falsify the records. The absolute certainty of their victory was disintegrating into dust before their very eyes. Todd leaned over and whispered frantically to the lead attorney. Todd's entire physical freedom depended on winning this exact hearing. If they walked out of this courtroom without the conservatorship order, his massive, fraudulent bridge loan would immediately default. He would lose his mansion, his cars, and he would face federal prison for his separate embezzlement crimes. He was desperate, cornered, and entirely out of options. He pushed his lawyer hard, demanding that he do something to regain control of the narrative. The lead mercenary attorney was highly paid for a reason. He was absolutely ruthless, and he refused to surrender a massive $2 million estate without a brutal fight. He stood up, straightening his suit jacket, and loudly interrupted the judge's reading. He realized that the medical argument was completely dead. The neurological proof from the National Institute was absolute and unassailable. He could no longer argue that I was physically demented. He had to instantly pivot his entire strategy to a completely different angle of attack. The attorney raised his voice, trying to recapture the commanding presence he had lost. He addressed Judge Davis, claiming that even if the court accepted the new medical evaluations regarding my physical brain chemistry, the conservatorship must still be immediately granted. He argued that cognitive health does not automatically equal financial responsibility. He stated that regardless of my medical scans, my recent behavioral actions proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was acting recklessly and completely squandering my assets. He pointed his finger at me again, trying to paint a new picture of a dangerous rogue individual. He reminded the judge that I had intentionally vanished from my home for 3 days, living in cheap motels. He loudly highlighted my deliberate failure to attend the mandatory psychiatric check with the state social worker yesterday afternoon. He argued that no responsible adult ignores a direct court order unless they are trying to hide something deeply troubling. The lawyer slammed his hand down on his table. He demanded that the court maintain the immediate freeze on my entire $2 million retirement portfolio. He argued that I was clearly engaged in highly secretive and erratic financial behavior. He claimed that if the court released the funds back into my control today, I would instantly liquidate the money and destroy the inheritance that Melissa was simply trying to protect. He begged the judge to grant the financial conservatorship to save my estate from my own reckless, impulsive destruction. Melissa sat up straighter, wiping her face and nodding vigorously in agreement with her lawyer. She was desperately clinging to this new lifeline. Todd stopped sweating and smirked slightly, believing his expensive lawyer had successfully saved their criminal scheme by shifting the focus entirely to my money. They thought they had trapped me in a new corner. They genuinely believed that my $2 million personal account was the absolute center of my financial universe. They were completely unaware that Bradley Collins was holding the final corporate document that would utterly annihilate their entire existence. The heavy silence in the courtroom felt absolute. Judge Mitchell Davis leaned over his elevated wooden desk, waiting for my response. He looked at me with the gentle patience one reserves for a frightened child. Melissa sat at the petitioner table, dabbing her dry eyes with a white tissue. Todd sat beside her with his arms casually resting on the armrests, radiating a quiet, arrogant certainty. Their expensive legal team watched me with expressions of utter boredom. They had delivered their flawless theatrical performance, and now they were simply waiting for the inevitable surrender. They fully expected me to mumble an incoherent defense, or to fly into a paranoid rage that would perfectly validate their entire fabricated case. I did not raise my voice. I did not begin to shout or plead for mercy. I simply took a deep breath and let the physical disguise fall away completely. I straightened my spine, pushing my shoulders back. I lifted my chin and looked Judge Davis directly in the eye with the cold, piercing focus of a master engineer inspecting a severely flawed blueprint. The subtle shift in my physical posture was instantaneous and striking. The frail, broken old man they had dragged into this room vanished into thin air. I spoke with a clear, steady, and commanding voice that echoed sharply off the hard stone walls. I told the judge that while I was fully capable of defending my own mental competency, I preferred to let my corporate counsel handle the formal legal submissions. Before the judge could even process the sudden change in my demeanor, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Bradley Collins stood up from his seat in the back row of the public gallery. He walked down the center aisle with the slow, measured steps of an absolute apex predator entering a cage full of frightened animals. He was wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue suit that made the expensive outfits of Melissa's legal team look cheap by comparison. He carried a single, thick, black leather binder. The entire courtroom turned to watch him approach the wooden gate that separated the gallery from the legal tables. Melissa's lead attorney immediately jumped to his feet. His face flushed red with sudden confusion and anger. He pointed a finger at Bradley and loudly objected to his presence. He told the judge that the respondent was a medically documented victim of severe neurodegenerative disease and was therefore entirely legally incompetent to hire outside counsel. He demanded that Bradley be removed from the courtroom immediately so the conservatorship order could be finalized. Bradley did not even look at the opposing lawyer. He walked through the wooden gate and approached the judge's bench. He spoke with a calm, lethal authority that instantly commanded the entire room. He officially introduced himself as the primary corporate attorney and legal representative for Mr. Richard Vernon. He informed the judge that the opposing counsel was operating under a foundation of absolute medical fiction. He stated that he was not here to argue about my mental state. He was here to present unassailable scientific fact. Judge Davis held up his hand, demanding silence from Melissa's panicked legal team. He looked at Bradley with a mixture of intense curiosity and deep judicial suspicion. He asked Bradley what exactly he intended to submit to the court that could possibly counter the sworn psychiatric affidavit already entered into the official record. Bradley placed the thick black leather binder directly onto the judge's elevated desk. The heavy thud of the binder hitting the wood sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. Bradley announced that he was submitting the comprehensive results of a 3-day exhaustive neurological and cognitive evaluation. He specified that this evaluation was not conducted over a 10-minute remote video call by a private doctor with a history of questionable billing practices. He stated that this examination was performed entirely in person at the premier National Neurological Research Institute in the country. He read the names of the 3 independent board-certified neurosurgeons and cognitive specialists who had personally overseen the testing. The color instantly drained from Melissa's face. The tissue slipped from her fingers and fell onto the table. Todd gripped the armrests of his chair so hard his knuckles turned completely white. They had built their entire criminal conspiracy on the assumption that I was isolated, trapped, and completely incapable of defending myself. They had absolutely no idea that I possessed the resources to fly across state lines and secure the most prestigious medical defense on the entire continent. Bradley opened the binder for the judge. He did not rely on emotional appeals or theatrical tears. He relied purely on ruthless, documented data. He guided the judge through the high-resolution brain scans, proving the complete absence of any physical deterioration. He pointed to the flawless scores from the intensive psychological stress tests. He read the final sworn conclusion signed by the chief of neurology. The conclusion explicitly stated that Richard Vernon possessed exceptional cognitive function, perfect memory retention, and absolute mental clarity. The courtroom remained deathly silent as Judge Davis read the documents. He flipped through the pages, reading the pristine medical data from an institution whose reputation was completely beyond reproach. The atmosphere in the room shifted violently. The sympathetic warmth that had filled the judge's eyes while he listened to Melissa's tearful testimony completely evaporated. It was rapidly replaced by a cold, terrifying judicial fury. A judge is the ultimate master of his courtroom, and there is nothing a judge hates more than realizing he has been deliberately manipulated and lied to by a weeping witness. Judge Davis looked up from the black binder and stared directly at Melissa's lead attorney. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. He held up the fraudulent affidavit signed by Dr. Bergman. He asked the opposing counsel if he was absolutely certain about the origin and the validity of this specific medical document. The aggressive lawyer who had been booming with confidence just 10 minutes ago suddenly looked incredibly small. He stammered slightly, trying to defend the document. He claimed his firm had relied on the medical professionals provided by the petitioner. He was already trying to legally distance himself from my daughter. Bradley did not give them a single second to recover. He stepped forward and delivered the next crushing blow. He formally requested that Judge Davis strike the fraudulent affidavit from the official court record entirely. But he went even further. He formally requested that the court immediately forward Dr. Bergman's forged evaluation to the State Medical Licensing Board and to the District Attorney's Office for an immediate criminal investigation into severe medical fraud and perjury. Melissa let out a sharp, terrified gasp. She looked at Todd with wide, panicked eyes. Her beautiful, pristine mask was completely shattering. She realized that the weapon she had used to try and destroy my life was now being turned directly against her and her corrupt accomplices. If the district attorney investigated Dr. Bergman, the doctor would instantly turn on Melissa to save his own medical license. He would testify that she had paid him to falsify the records. The absolute certainty of their victory was disintegrating into dust before their very eyes. Todd leaned over and whispered frantically to the lead attorney. Todd's entire physical freedom depended on winning this exact hearing. If they walked out of this courtroom without the conservatorship order, his massive fraudulent bridge loan would immediately default. He would lose his mansion, his cars, and he would face federal prison for his separate embezzlement crimes. He was desperate, cornered, and entirely out of options. He pushed his lawyer hard, demanding that he do something to regain control of the narrative. The lead mercenary attorney was highly paid for a reason. He was absolutely ruthless, and he refused to surrender a massive $2 million estate without a brutal fight. He stood up, straightening his suit jacket, and loudly interrupted the judge's reading. He realized that the medical argument was completely dead. The neurological proof from the National Institute was absolute and unassailable. He could no longer argue that I was physically demented. He had to instantly pivot his entire strategy to a completely different angle of attack. The attorney raised his voice, trying to recapture the commanding presence he had lost. He addressed Judge Davis, claiming that even if the court accepted the new medical evaluations regarding my physical brain chemistry, the conservatorship must still be immediately granted. He argued that cognitive health does not automatically equal financial responsibility. He stated that regardless of my medical scans, my recent behavioral actions proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was acting recklessly and completely squandering my assets. He pointed his finger at me again, trying to paint a new picture of a dangerous, rogue individual. He reminded the judge that I had intentionally vanished from my home for 3 days, living in cheap motels. He loudly highlighted my deliberate failure to attend the mandatory psychiatric check with the state social worker yesterday afternoon. He argued that no responsible adult ignores a direct court order unless they are trying to hide something deeply troubling. The lawyer slammed his hand down on his table. He demanded that the court maintain the immediate freeze on my entire $2 million retirement portfolio. He argued that I was clearly engaged in highly secretive and erratic financial behavior. He claimed that if the court released the funds back into my control today, I would instantly liquidate the money and destroy the inheritance that Melissa was simply trying to protect. He begged the judge to grant the financial conservatorship to save my estate from my own reckless, impulsive destruction. Melissa sat up straighter, wiping her face and nodding vigorously in agreement with her lawyer. She was desperately clinging to this new lifeline. Todd stopped sweating and smirked slightly, believing his expensive lawyer had successfully saved their criminal scheme by shifting the focus entirely to my money. They thought they had trapped me in a new corner. They genuinely believed that my $2 million personal account was the absolute center of my financial universe. They were completely unaware that Bradley Collins was holding the final corporate document that would utterly annihilate their entire existence. Judge Davis did not immediately respond to the frantic demands of the opposing lawyer. He completely ignored the aggressive mercenary standing at the podium, shouting about my supposed financial irresponsibility. Instead, the judge turned his absolute attention back to the thick black leather binder resting on his elevated desk. Bradley Collins had placed one final document at the very back of the medical files. It was printed on heavy corporate stationery, bearing a watermark that the judge clearly recognized from his years dealing with massive municipal development cases. I watched the judge read the first paragraph. The stern judicial annoyance that had directed his earlier actions completely vanished. It was instantly replaced by a look of profound shock. He took off his reading glasses and stared at the paper for a long, unbroken minute. The courtroom became so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents in the ceiling. The opposing attorney stood awkwardly at his podium, waiting for a ruling on his desperate financial argument. He had absolutely no idea he was standing on a landmine that had already been triggered. Judge Davis slowly raised his head. He did not look at the aggressive lawyer. He did not look at Todd. He looked directly across the courtroom at my daughter. Melissa was still holding her crumpled white tissue, and her face was a mask of desperate, fake vulnerability. Judge Davis spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper but carried the absolute weight of a physical blow. He asked her a single question. "Do you know who Mr. Vernon actually is?" Melissa blinked rapidly. The question made absolutely no sense to her. She looked at her lead attorney for guidance, but the lawyer was just as confused as she was. She looked back at the judge and offered a trembling, manufactured answer. She said I was her father and a retired civil engineer who was losing his mind. She tried to force another fake tear to fall down her cheek. Judge Davis did not offer her an ounce of sympathy. He shook his head and placed the heavy corporate document down on his desk. He looked at Melissa with absolute unfiltered disgust. He told her she had just committed severe perjury in his courtroom by swearing she was trying to protect a frail pensioner from financial ruin. Bradley Collins stepped forward. He did not ask for permission to speak. He simply took absolute command of the room. He addressed the opposing counsel and the completely bewildered petitioners. He informed them that the $2 million retirement account they were currently fighting over was nothing more than a minor decoy fund. It was the financial equivalent of spare change left in the pocket of an old winter coat. Bradley opened his pristine leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of highly classified corporate registration documents. He walked over to the petitioner table and dropped a copy directly in front of Melissa's lead attorney. He handed another certified copy to the court clerk. Bradley turned to address the entire courtroom. He stated clearly and emphatically that the man sitting at the respondent table was not a confused retired engineer. He formally introduced me to the court as the sole proprietor and absolute controlling executive of Apex Holdings. He explained with brutal clarity that Apex Holdings was a $30 million commercial real estate empire that owned and operated half the industrial shipping infrastructure in the state. I watched the heavy words wash over my daughter. Her jaw literally dropped. The fake tears completely stopped flowing. She stared at me as if I had just taken off a human mask to reveal an alien creature underneath. The reality of my true wealth completely shattered the pathetic narrative she had spent months building. The frail victim she thought she had successfully caged was actually an untouchable corporate titan. But the identity reveal was only the foundation of the execution. Todd had been sitting rigidly in his chair, processing the massive number Bradley had just spoken aloud. $30 million. He looked at me with a sudden sickening greed flashing in his eyes. Even in the face of his crumbling medical conspiracy, his immediate thought was about how he could still somehow access that massive fortune to save his skin. He was completely blinded by his own absolute desperation. Bradley turned his predatory gaze directly onto Todd. Bradley asked Todd if he had enjoyed his meeting at the high-rise downtown yesterday afternoon. Todd flinched violently. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. He had kept his predatory bridge loan a complete secret from the court, from his lawyers, and even from his own wife. He did not understand how my corporate attorney knew about a highly private financial meeting. Bradley did not leave him in suspense. He walked back to his briefcase and pulled out the finalized acquisition contracts for Vanguard Capital Partners. He held the heavy legal documents up for the entire room to see. He explained to the judge that Apex Holdings had executed a massive hostile cash buyout overnight. He stated that as of midnight last night, my corporation had legally absorbed Vanguard Capital Partners and assumed absolute control over their entire high-risk debt portfolio. Bradley walked directly up to Todd. He dropped the final execution clause of the bridge loan onto the wooden table. It was the exact document Todd had blindly signed yesterday, guaranteeing his massive loan with my personal estate. Bradley spoke with the cold, mechanical precision of a firing squad commander. He explained the exact terms of the contract Todd had signed. He told the judge that Todd had secured a $1.5 million commercial loan using entirely fraudulent collateral. He pointed a sharp finger at the forged medical affidavit they had just tried to use in court. Bradley stated that presenting forged psychiatric documents to secure a commercial loan constituted an immediate, unforgivable default under the strict ironclad terms of his own signed contract. Todd opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. He looked like a man drowning inside a glass box. He frantically grabbed the papers on the table, desperately looking for a legal loophole that did not exist. Bradley leaned over the table, casting a long, dark shadow over my son-in-law. He told Todd to look at the final page of the packet. He told him to look at the timestamp on the asset seizure authorization. Todd flipped with trembling hands to the back of the packet. He saw my authentic signature. He saw the time. 9:00 in the morning. Bradley looked at the large analog clock mounted on the courtroom wall. It was now 9:15. Bradley announced to the room that the execution orders had already been fully authorized and dispatched. He looked directly into Todd's panicked, vacant eyes. He told him that exactly 15 minutes ago, a private corporate security team had arrived at his upscale suburban mansion. He informed Todd that the custom locks on his front door had already been drilled out and completely replaced. He told him that his expensive leased luxury vehicles were currently being loaded onto flatbed tow trucks. He stated with absolute legal certainty that Todd's logistics company bank accounts had been completely drained and frozen by Apex Holdings to satisfy the immediate massive default penalty. The lead mercenary attorney was staring at the corporate documents in absolute horror. He was a highly experienced financial lawyer, and he immediately understood the lethal mathematical perfection of the trap. He slowly backed away from the petitioner table, creating physical distance between himself and his clients, as if they were carrying a highly contagious disease. He realized in an instant that they had absolutely no money left to pay his exorbitant legal fees. He realized he had just presented forged medical documents to a federal judge on behalf of completely bankrupt criminals. He closed his briefcase and stood silently against the wall, abandoning them entirely. Bradley turned back to Judge Davis to deliver the final concluding strike. He stated that as of this exact minute, Todd was instantly, completely, and legally bankrupt. He possessed no home, no cars, no company, and absolutely no liquid capital. He had mortgaged his entire physical existence to escape a federal prison sentence, and he had unknowingly handed the master key directly to the man he was trying to legally murder. Melissa let out a raw, guttural scream. It was not a theatrical sob designed to manipulate the judge. It was the genuine, terrifying sound of a woman watching her entire pristine universe collapse into ash. She grabbed Todd by the lapels of his expensive charcoal suit, screaming at him, demanding to know what he had signed behind her back. Todd just stared straight ahead, his eyes completely vacant, and his mind unable to process the absolute magnitude of his destruction. He was breathing in short, frantic, panicked gasps. The mansion was permanently gone. The money to pay off the angry investors was gone. The federal auditors were going to arrive next week and find absolutely nothing but a hollow shell legally owned by his father-in-law. I remained seated perfectly still at my empty table. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched the inevitable consequence of their profound arrogance unfold in real time. They had brought me to this courthouse to strip me of my human dignity and lock me in a medical cage. Instead, they had unknowingly walked directly into their own complete financial execution. The silent adjustment had reached its absolute pinnacle. But the financial ruin was only the first half of my promise. They were completely destitute, but they were not yet in handcuffs. It was time to introduce the criminal evidence and finish the demolition permanently. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that blood does not guarantee loyalty, and silence should never be mistaken for weakness. We spend our lives building fortresses to protect our children from the harsh world, completely forgetting that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones we invite to our own dinner tables. True family is defined by absolute mutual respect, not simply by shared genetics. When those you love choose absolute greed over your basic humanity, you must have the courage to strike back with cold precision. Never allow your past sacrifices to become the weapons they use to build your permanent cage. If you believe in fighting back against arrogant betrayal, hit the subscribe button and let me know in the comments how you would have handled this situation.